All right, that's good. Showing you good.
That's the camera.
Good. All right. Wow, I'm sorry.
Use the microphone, you happy booming.
Sorry?
Use the microphone, you happy booming.
I'll boom. I think it'll work. What do you think?
I'm confident.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll make a start. Thanks all for coming. I know if I put Ben on the poster drawing a crowd. So today's talk is by Professor Anders Stephanson from University of Columbia, who is the Andrew and Virginia Road Family Foundation Professor at Columbia. And this year he's visiting the LSE in London for the academic year. He's the author of many different works and books, particularly Ken and the Art of Foreign Policy, which came out at Harvard in 1989, and the book Manifest Destiny, which came out in 1995. He's also notable for having written a number of articles and chapters, some of which I think, safe in saying, a number among some fairly provocative interpretations of the Cold War and its gestation and duration, all these various things. And which are, if you get the chance to read them, extremely thought-provoking in terms of how to understand American history in the 20th century. He's also a regular reviewer for the New Left Review. His talk today, as you can see, well, this is one of the titles we've got, is Presenting the Philippines, World Expositions, Architecture, Empire, Concrete Roads, Race, and Maybe the Real. He said this could go from between 12 minutes to 2.5 hours. I've said 45 minutes would be optimal. So we shall see. If someone wants to take a stake on and see how it goes and run a book or something, maybe we can. When Anders has finished, however long it takes, he'll then be grilled by Dr. Ben Opweiler from the University of Nottingham, who did his PhD here on Johnson-Nixon and US-Iranian relations, which is forthcoming with Palgrave as a book. And he's also a leading light, along with Michelle Green, on the website United Studies, US Studies Online, something like that, which is affiliated to BAS. So I shall now shut up and hand over to Anders, who shall talk for a while.
Yes. All right. This lecture, I should warn you, it's only images, so even if it goes long, it tends to be okay. Secondly, it has no single argument. It has no single line of thought, I was about to say. It's a series of tangents, and you could argue that the sum total is considerably less than the constituent parts of it, for which I apologize. It's actually a lecture that's grown over years to become a bit of a monster for me. I've become interested at various points in tangents, and the tangents don't really add up. So I've decided to give it a couple of times this year in order to sort of recuperate the argument, and I will tell you where the original point, which I nicked from Tim Mitchell, arises in the talk. But we're going to begin here. And so I'm going to do a little journey, as it were, from London Hyde Park in 1851 through, roughly speaking, the Philippines up to circa 1910. And if there is a focal point to this, it is precisely ways of looking, ways of understanding, grasping the real. In particular, the problem from the US standpoint in 1898 through 1910, to understand what this new space, society, set of societies, colonial possession called the Philippines was really all about. This, of course, is the Crystal Palace, what becomes known as the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851. The extraordinary construction And what interests me about this is, to no little degree, precisely the construction of the Crystal Palace, the iron and glass construction, a startlingly modern kind of structure for 1851. Really extraordinary by all standard. If you think that this looks like a greenhouse, you'd be absolutely right, because the chum, Joseph Paxton, who actually came up with the idea, was a gardener from the beginning. And so it is, in fact, a greenhouse of sorts. It was then moved, of course, to Sydenham, to the present day, quote-unquote, Crystal Palace, where it burned down in the 1930s. You get it. This is actually from when it had been moved from Hyde Park in the 19th century to South London. But it gives you a sense of the extraordinary scale of this building. It's the world's largest building in the 1850s, put up in about 4 months. It was the first public space in the UK where classes mingled. This is an aside that I think is quite interesting in its own right. It's the source of great deal of worry for the aging Duke of Wellington, who was the security chief in London at that time, kept 10,000 soldiers in reserve. Should there be any kind of untoward consequences of the mixing of classes, glass being not only a novel kind of building material, but also very brittle and very thin, and he was worried about that aspect. This is also from Sydenham when it had been moved, but it's a staggeringly large kind of exhibition. Victoria, Queen Victoria, was so moved that she actually wept when she opened this together with Prince Cohort. Its official title, I have to read this, Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. 6 million came to see it. What was really celebrated was empire, industry, free trade, all the things that Britain at the height of its hegemony in the mid-19th century was thought to stand for. The imperial aspect being of particular interest in the trajectory I'm going to present in this course. The exotic and the imperial possessions and what might be, what they might actually signify. But empire as such is not a problem in this exhibition. It's not as though empire is constitutive of what is being presented. What's being presented is empire as the UK, empire as industry, and in this startlingly modern sort of manner. So we're going to jump, and I'm going to do a fast forward sort of thing till we get to the 1890s for these exhibitions. And the height of these exhibitions, world exposition, is actually the period between the 1870s and the period up to World War I. Napoleon III, Paris in the 1860s is interesting as a permutation for what is to come here in the US context in the 1890s. It's a permutation in the sense that he'd been to London, seen Crystal Palace, he was deeply, deeply, deeply impressed with it, and so when the project of building a new market centre, Lial, in Paris came up, he was insisting that there would be a glass and iron element to this. It's not a complete copycat kind of construction from the viewpoint of Crystal Palace, but it's deeply influenced by Crystal Palace. And of course, torn down, one of the great crimes of architectural recent history by Pompidou in 1970, I believe, to make way for this incipient post-modern crap that we now see in the area. But in any case, he was also, however, experimenting with this sort of thing based on his primary institution of architectural taste and education and pedagogy, L'École de Beaux-Arts in Paris, with roots going back all the way to the Baroque period, but also to the first Napoleon. One of the Grand Écoles, an école that would be extraordinarily influential in the way the United States actually approached this, as we will see in a minute. A kind of riff, if you will, on Baroque architecture and Baroque kinds of concepts. So we bear that in mind when we move over to the United States, which is the really object of this exercise. The first moment here is 1876, centenary of 1776, Philadelphia. Looks more like a kind of factory layout, and it's not a particularly interesting and exciting show in its own right, but there is a copycat element to it. Crystal Palace, again, constituting the chief reference in this otherwise not particularly exciting kind of architecture, but steel and glass element is nevertheless the connecting point. If you will, ideological essence of that 1776 movement, aside from celebrating, 1876, celebrating 1776, is really industrial progress. There's got nothing about empire in there because there is no empire. They're still suffering from the after effect of the Civil War. There was one actual earlier copycat version, which is an almost direct copy, the ill-fated Crystal Palace in New York in 1853, burnt down in 54. It was a terrible show, didn't really have anything going for it except for the fact that it was a clear-cut imitation of Crystal Palace. So, back to Paris. Back to Paris in 1889. An Exposition universelle, though it wasn't actually universal at all. The fact, of course, being that no monarchy would celebrate 1789. All these shows are kind of put forth at this stage as centenaries or bicentenaries or celebrations of something or other. And 1889 is the celebration, of course, of the French Revolution, issuing a couple of years afterwards, of course, in the chopping off of Louis XVI's head. Therefore, no monarchy is present. Nevertheless, it is an extraordinary show, dominated by the gentleman on the lower end here, the engineer Eiffel, and his monstrously ugly, by the standards of the time, Tour Eiffel. But the whole construction of the spaces of this exposition is very much in, again, the modern idiom of Crystal Palace and what comes after it, steel and glass. Celebrating, this is the palace of the machinery, industrial progress. However, there is, if you look very closely through the legs of the Tour Eiffel, the center of the exhibition, which is this, again, Napoleonic, Baroque, Beaux-Arts kind of structure, the central palace in front, in fact, of the hall of the machinery, adorned with this, again, typical, as we will see, typical kind of allegorical, sculptural, excessive, again, proto-neo-Baroque sort of structure, the compilation of the group sculpture that you see here. More interesting, perhaps from our standpoint, is also the first one which in a sustained way celebrates, investigates, puts at the center of things, the new systematized Western empire, colonial empire in this case, the French Empire, Palais de Colonel. In the last third of the 19th century, empire becoming a Western systemic sort of feature and a thing about which people thought and conceptualized quite extensively. And this is part and parcel of this. In particular, it highlighted the new colony called Annam, present-day Vietnam or Indochina, by creating a seemingly real kind of Vietnam right there and then, with real Vietnamese. The real pièce de résistance, however, was the so-called Cairo Street. The Cairo Street was a real Egyptian street, presumably. And this is where I want to stop and reflect for 2 seconds. Because the Cairo Street with real donkeys, real Arabs, intentionally a crooked street, seemingly taken directly from Cairo, the real Cairo, didn't really have an impact as the real itself. The paradoxical thing about this, which is the virtual reality of this moment, I would argue, is that by being so stunningly real, or seemingly real, it announced that it wasn't really real, but that there had to be a kind of real Cairo in Cairo that needed to be, that could be addressed and objectified and understood in certain ways. It is part and parcel, I take this from Tim Mitchell, he takes it from Heidegger, of a new kind of way of understanding the real towards the end of the 19th century, where everything is set up before you as though it is a picture, as though it is an image of something that had to be an image of something real. So the reality effect is not that this is real, and it's one reality amongst many realities, the real that has a referent that is real. So that when you actually go to the real Cairo, you think, well, this is also, in a sense, a picture that needs to be corrected. Because that's the upshot of this reality effect. This is something crooked that needs to be straightened. It's also part and parcel of a certain change in the way in which representations of the peculiar happens in this period. This is the moment in which, in the 19th century, museums go from being repositories of very odd, curious things, one after another, no seeming connection between these curiosities, to being a systemic or systematic pedagogical exercise. Here is something typical of this period, here is the next room, here is something typical of this period, which is a very different kind of conception of what is being presented as the real or as the typical. So let's bear the Cairo Street in mind for the future, for future reference, which gets us to the first great American exposition, which is Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. It's, of course, the wrong year. It's celebrating, I had to come up with something. The US presence in 1889 had been terrible. And this is, after all, you know, the new kind of actor on the horizon, and it was felt everywhere that given the success, with 30 million plus actually coming to see the French exhibition, that the US really had to do something to compete. 1892 would be the kind of occasion for this. Absurdly, Chicago won out over New York inland as the place to celebrate Columbus' arrival in the New World. And so what do we have? What do we get? We get this kind of idiom. Take a good peek at this. This is the central basin of the Chicago Exposition. A lot of incredibly conservative, backward-looking, it seems. Those are neoclassical architectures. One would think, 40 years after this, that it would have moved on instead of going backwards, but it's paradoxically the case that the Chicago Exposition and the neoclassical idiom that governed it was a kind of statement of modernity. Orchestrated by this guy, Daniel Burnham. Daniel Burnham, actually, this is a painting by the Swedish society painter Anders Zorn. Made a fortune by going to the US around this time and actually painting famous people. Very good painter, actually. He wanted this to be, as he put it, an encyclopedia of civilization. And civilization is an essential aspect of this because, as I will argue further on down the talk, this is a moment in which the United States, or those who thought about the United States in relation to the outside, understood the United States, or the problem of the United States, that it isn't or hasn't been properly connected to the rest of the Western world. I.e., there is a connection, a line of continuity in this kind of conception. And the Chicago show is probably the primary example of this, of a non-exceptionalist understanding of the United States as the United States in the context of a wider kind of civilizational, Western civilizational context. So it's anti-exceptionalist, very explicitly anti-exceptionalist. Of course, Burnham is most well known, if you're from New York, for his Flatiron building put up in the early 1900s, this kind of triangular structure on 23rd, 5th, and Broadway. He was actually, in point of fact, a very determined modernist, not at all a reactionary in architectural terms if you actually scrape the surface. This is one of his buildings in Chicago where he was based. He, like every other architect of note, or most of them in the Chicago Exposition, had been students at the School of Beaux-Arts in Paris. And he engaged the famous landscape architect Olmsted to help him out. Well, Olmsted was engaged from the beginning to figure out how to do this show. I should say, actually, Burnham is also notable because he's the guy who comes up with the technology, the technique for doing foundations in the soggy ground of Chicago for skyscrapers. So the first skyscrapers in Chicago are actually Burnham creations. Very inventive guy. Anyway, as you can see, the Chicago show here on the Lake of Michigan actually deployed waterways very efficiently and extensively. So here again is the central space of this show, this neoclassical basin, looking out towards Lake Michigan in this particular instance. All of the architects who constructed these neoclassical buildings had to maintain the same level of the cornice in a typical Beaux-Arts kind of conception, symmetry and symmetry and structure being essentially unified. This is the entrance from Lake Michigan with the quadriga, the equine sculpture group on top. This is Columbus riding a carriage, 4 horses, into the New World. Again, typical allegorical invention. There's other versions of our friend here with a cross and a sword coming into the New World and taking over the New World. But the neoclassical version is more interesting from our standpoint. This came to be known as the White City, which you may or may not have heard of before. It was white because it was hygienic and sanitized and clean and unified and beautiful. It was white because it was electrified, it was light, and it was white because, by extension, it actually became understood as racially white. In essence, it is a counterpoint to the ambiance of Chicago. What is Chicago in 1893? Chicago in 1893 is a bustling immigrant city, absolutely anarchic in terms of its architecture, as most big American cities. No city plan, no unified structure or idea behind it. From that standpoint, this is the counterpoint par excellence, an extreme counterpoint to the kinds of anarchic non-planning that American big cities of this type actually seem to constitute. Smelly, disorganized, ungovernable, and all the rest. This is cleanliness, orderliness, or if that's the word I want, precision, clarity of a European kind, harping back to classical concepts. This is the ship of state run by, well, Columbus is on top, Father Time is governing it, and then you can see all the rest of this stuff. A little over the top, people said at the time even, but it did well at night when it was lit up. The juxtaposition between these allegorical and neoclassical figures and the good old sort of American horse and yeoman farmer on the left is also kind of significant. This is a statue of the Republic. Daniel French's kind of homage, I was about to say, to the Statue of Liberty, which a couple of years earlier had been transported from France. Another allegorical woman signifying liberty. In that case, here is the Republic. This is a kind of local reference. He then transferred the top of this, the head of this, to Columbia University, which was then being constructed in the city of New York, my own university, on a hilltop, the highest natural point. If you're ever in Manhattan, and you come up to see Columbia, remember that you're actually at the highest natural spot in the island of Manhattan. It was built and it was conceived after Seth Low, the president, went to see the Chicago show as precisely an Acropolis kind of Greek structure on Morningside Heights. In fact, they renamed, the university renamed the area Morningside Heights as a result of this. The architect was Burnham's right-hand man at Chicago, McKim. This is McKim's, and I love these names, Palace of Agriculture. On the basin to the left, or if you look at it from the stamp of the position towards the inside from Lake Michigan, and that's the cupola, which he then transferred directly to. This again is my own kind of personal background and place. This is Columbia University in the city of New York. So he actually lifted this directly from his construction at Chicago. How could they actually build these, gigantic neoclassical buildings? Well, they're all fake. They're fake in the sense that they're basically just a steel structure plus plaster, which is why they're very brittle. Columbia's Low Library, which is the central building in Columbia, is not that brittle. It's actually built on granite. The ultimate model is Pantheon in Rome, of course, well, not of course, but that's what it is. So this is present-day Columbia University, which is built, again, as a direct consequence of the aesthetic of the Chicago show. The Chicago show is a stone's throw away from the new neo-Gothic University of Chicago. The neo-Gothic being medieval in implication, spiritual, lent itself to churches, lent itself to university structure, Yale's Sterling Library at the same time, and so forth and so on. The neoclassical, as refracted through the Renaissance, is a different kind of idiom. It's a different kind of politics attached to it, a different kind of aesthetics, but also a different kind of politics. Not the medieval, as it were, spiritual, but something that is A, imperial by implication, because the Rome is the central of the two kind of classical reference, not Greece. And secondly, in a way, you could argue civilizational in a different format from the middle, civilizational and scientific in a different sort of way from that. The only real discordant vote and representation in Chicago is from Louis Sullivan, indigenous architect, and his young assistant, Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the Palace of Transportation, if you can dig that. A completely different kind of approach to things. Louis Sullivan hated the neoclassical imposition. He said it set back US architecture 50 years, and he was almost right about that, because as an idiom, as opposed to a contextual intervention, it is really quite extraordinarily reactionary. There was also entertainment, what became known as the Midway Plaisance, which is a melange of old fake milieu from Europe and new anthropological exhibits. Here is the one invention, so to speak, of the correspondent invention sign of this exposition, which is the Ferris wheel. This is the first Ferris wheel. The guy, obviously, who invented this or came up with the construction was Ferris. It is then reproduced at every single one of these expositions from now on. It was the biggest success of this exposition. But you can see this is the quaint kind of European would-be ambiance, but coupled with anthropological shows that we will see in a minute. Also industry, a variety of the usual kind of progressive showpieces of this period, but also a fake model, a concrete model of the battleship of Illinois. We're not yet in imperial times. The Germans came to show the pride of their industrial development, which is the Krupp guns. So let's take a very quick look out across the anthropological aspects of this, because it's quite important. First of all, the Amerindians. The Amerindians will be everywhere in these shows in one way or another, usually juxtaposed in this sort of way. You see the Indian sculpture, equine sculpture on the right, against the backdrop of the palace of mining, improbably. But there are also more exotic exhibits. This is the Java village, a supposedly real Java village, and this is the entrance to the Dahomey, the French African village. Again, it's the idiom and the logic of the Cairo Street. The Cairo Street made it across the Atlantic to Chicago. The same crooked street, the same donkeys and the same Arabs, presumably the same reality effect, where you can ride camels and all the rest of it. And there is a mosque even, though it has kind of risque belly dancing going on inside him, also, widely improbably. This is an enormous success 27 million people came to see this show. But it is on the cusp of, on the very verge of the Depression of 1893 through 1896, which will be hitting Chicago in the most extraordinarily powerful ways. The Chicago site became, which was nearby, by the way, to the foul-smelling meat slaughtering industry, for squatters, and burnt down extensively in 1894, by which time we're in a wild, very violent moment of labor strife, strikes, and conflict in the United States at large, and also Chicago as such. There is a little kind of side note to this, that this is the Dewey, Admiral Dewey triumphant arc, a plaster construction in the middle of Broadway, Fifth Avenue, 23rd Street. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, that's the site where Burnham built the Flatiron building. If you look up to the right, you see the only skyscraper north of 23rd Street in Manhattan at this point, built by McKim's partner White. You could see this is the quadriga again on top of Dewey's. This is, again, it's just fake. 2 years later, it sort of essentially disintegrated. They tried to make it permanent, but they weren't allowed to because he was running for president in 1900. Quick side glance at the next big show, which is the Buffalo Pan American Exposition of 1901. Notable, again, for the cleanliness, the hygienic, scientific. I like this comment, actually. Republic sustaining commerce of the continent. It's, of course, electricity, Niagara Falls nearby. It's also famous from our standpoint because it is the place where McKinley is assassinated. The weird thing being that the hospital he was at didn't have electricity. One of the reasons he actually died after 3 weeks, nor did they actually have the capacity to use the X-ray machine, which was being exhibited in this show. Notable from our standpoint also because it is the first kind of investigation show of the new, exotic and very peculiar new annexed territory called the Philippines. This is a Philippine village that was put on display. The Cairo Street and all the rest of it was also present, but I'll leave that aside. The Philippine village, a very small kind of sample of what the Philippines supposedly was all about. 100 people and nothing more, but nevertheless acknowledged. Which leads us to the real kind of final show of this initial survey, and then we'll go to the real Philippines. This bucolic park in St. Louis being the site where they wanted to celebrate, a year late, again, 1904, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The morose gentleman to the left, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte, who sold it, and the very seemingly happy but more upbeat Thomas Jefferson, who bought it, on the right. Ivory City, not the White City, but equally white. Of course, St. Louis was a segregated city. This is the height of Jim Crow. And of course, we all know that St. Louis is still in the throes of this kind of racial problematic. Ferguson is not very far from actually where this exposition took place. Same neoclassical Beaux-Arts structure, typically a huge axis or a central axis coupled with a subsidiary axis, a unified kind of cornice height, and relentlessly exasperated, as somebody said, aesthetic of neoclassicism, Roman in particular, coupled again, the juxtaposition is typical. The withdrawing Indian, bison, the civilization that wasn't really a civilization on the North American continent, real Indians, Amerindians being exhibited. This gentleman is Geronimo, the fearsome Geronimo, again signifying obviously what seems to be a bygone era of power and savagery on the part of the American Indian, now kind of domesticated. It's also a celebration of the recent Cuban-American War, the War of 1898. This is a kind of model celebration of the battle, the naval battle of Santiago de Cuba. You can see the scale of this, as well as the by now familiar Cairo Street. Always a popular event at these shows. It was also, if you didn't know that, the site of the Olympics, a very small Olympics, but nevertheless an Olympics, 1904, coupled with an Olympics or a competition for the primitive peoples, quote unquote, where they could actually engage in the kind of things that primitive people supposedly were doing, like shooting bow and arrow. However, the St. Louis Exposition, Exposition is the first one that, in a structured, systemic way, presents anthropology in a scientific manner, presumably. Led by this man who was the head of the Anthropology Association of the United States, Professor McGee, here with Amerindians from Baja California. But there are lots and lots of these various so-called primitive exhibits, not mixed up with the entertainment part, the Midway Plaisance type of entertainment as at Chicago and Buffalo, but kept separate. Likewise, the progressive, by now straightforward, explicitly progressive kind of conception of what the United States was doing in relation to its own Amerindian population had come to the fore. This is a model assimilationist reservation school for Amerindians, featuring a women's basketball team. The real kind of exhibit of this type, however, is the so-called Philippine Reservation. Paul Kramer and others have written about this extensively. This is the Bridge of Spain that leads into Old Manila. And the show actually had a complete, seemingly realistic inventory reservation space, 47 acres, and 1,200 real Filipinos to demonstrate what the Philippine Islands annexation was really about. Here is the kind of map over the entire show, and the Filipino reservation is up on the right. Here's a more interesting map. The center of it is essentially the old Spanish part, and the new American modernizing, colonizing US, civilizationally more advanced version. The primitive, various stages of primitive groups and peoples structured around them. The gentleman who arranged this was the forthcoming President Taft, here on a suffering water buffalo. He weighed 300 pounds. He was the governor of the Philippine Islands, or the Philippines, and was keen to put this show on, organized it extensively with just terrifically expensive federal government, Philippine administration, and the local show actually financed it. This is the constabulary, and these are the scouts, the two kind of police or para-police forces that the United States had created in 1901. They kept order in the reservation. It's the basic kernel, or become the Filipino Army in the 1930s. Had his own marching bands. But the really interesting part of this is, of course, the various villages, the various exemplary groups. This is from the Moro, the Muslim village. This is from the Grito village, and this is from the Igorot village, the kind of most popular exhibit amongst the various Filipino would-be primitives. And this is their dog ceremony. This is very controversial because the G-string qualities of their outfits. Even the president had to intervene. Teddy Roosevelt had to come down and finally say it's okay because it's authentic to have these little light-clad versions rather than something in trousers. But this is hugely, hugely popular, precisely because of its exotic quality. The truth is that if you take the Philippines and the 30 different kind of ethnic communities that made up the 7,000 islands, they only constitute about 15% of the population. But when you actually see the Philippine Reservation as the real in 1904, you believe that this is an extraordinarily, quote-unquote, primitive space and very, very hard to make intelligible and legible, even though the intention of this show is, or this reservation on the part of TAF, is to create a legible space that is open for progressive reform on the one side and investment on the other. So this is the real bridge to Bridge of Spain in Manila. So let's go to the Philippines in the Philippines, as opposed to the representations of it. What does the United States bring to it? Well, here, of course, is an image of good government and commerce. A couple of map illustrations of this: the Pacific as an American lake, the kind of new imagination that pertained to the Pacific after the annexations of 1898, crisscrossing the Pacific as an American lake again, and the place of the Philippines in the penetration of East Asia, of course, the would-be centrality of Manila as the new American depot, entrepot space or opening to East Asia. Lots and lots and lots of various items along these lines in and around 1900. So what does it actually bring? Well, first of all, pacification. This is in every given kind of progressive / liberal kind of conception of empire, this is the essential first step, pacification. Pacification was understood to be essentially this: an American soldier essentially helping the grateful locals. Of course, as you know, 1899, the Filipino resistance centered on Luzon, but not exclusively under Aguinaldo, this gentleman, announced the foundation of a Filipino republic outside, of course, of the US sovereignty that had been established at the Peace of Paris in 1898. So what happened was, of course, again, we know this, a very bloody and very extensive war of subjugation, which would carry on in the first instance till 1902, but even after that, it lingered on for another decade. And the Moros, the Muslim Moros, were never really subjugated and remain unsubjugated in some sense in 2015. Voluntary regiments led by officers chiefly schooled in Indian warfare. You see lots of images of this kind in American media at the time, but or newspapers at the time, never an image of U.S. casualties. What they did acknowledge, though, were of course the incidences of U.S. Atrocities and torture. Up to a point, this was acknowledged. It was even investigated. This is the water cure, water torture. An image of American soldiers actually subjecting a Filipino to the water cure. One reason that the Americans actually managed to do pacification in the end was the overpowering Gatling machine gun, the introduction of the Gatling machine gun, which was just one of the many panoply of powerful military technology that the US actually deployed in subjugating them. But it was actually one of the few cases of fairly successful, you have to say in the end, fairly successful counterinsurgency. The first US attempt at counterinsurgency proper, and the most successful one, chiefly because they captured Aguinaldo. The gentleman who did this is this fascinating character actually called Stephanson, sitting to the right there. He was a veteran of the Cuban struggles. He had been a volunteer in the 1890s. He was in the Philippines. He would later on be in Mexico. I love this image. This is from The World, 1902. This is when Aguinaldo is just caught, and he's paraded as this really kind of savage and ludicrous figure, whereas in fact he was part of an elite, as we shall see in a minute. He then swore an oath of allegiance to the US and asked his comrades to put down their arms, which most of them did. And that was the end of the Luzon side of the insurrection. It carried on in Mindanao and to the south as well. One reason, but it was essentially expiring by then. One of the reasons that the US actually succeeded in this was because precisely they managed to mobilize an internal and domestic US, Filipino set of repressive forces. The US, unlike Britain, unlike France, did not have a colonial elite. It did not have a colonial mass of people that wanted to settle in the Philippines. It did not actually have a state apparatus that was well suited for this. It was run out of the War Department in a bureau of so-called insular affairs, insular meaning islands. But it did not have an extensive, machinery a la the European imperial powers at the same time for actually administrating this. So two categories of people came to do this. A, the military, in particular the Corps of Engineers, and two, a series of engineers, often civil but also military. Engineers are the real, if you will, kind of operators of American imperialism in the case of the Philippines. Now, I said that this expired, the insurgency expires by 1902 when Teddy Roosevelt declares peace. In fact, it broke out again and again and again. This is in 1906, and an insurrection in Mindanao with the Moros. Secondly, governmentality. This is a Baconian term called two things: discipline and punish on the one side. Various practices and policies having to do with the human individual / body on the other, biopower, if you want to put it that way. First, this is the second Philippine commission that oversaw the construction of a civil government, the government that Taft, to the right, sitting down, came to head as the first governor. The transition to a post-military occupation regime in the new colony and sort of semi-independence, or if that's what you want to call it. It involved undermining or robbing the previous Spanish leading segment of the population, the friars, the religious orders that actually owned a lot of the land in the Philippines, taking land from the Spanish religious orders and actually auctioning it off, selling it very cheaply to a new co-opted, largely mestizo ruling class, the first ruling class, national ruling class in the history of the Philippines. 3% of the population actually had the right to vote. The governor had absolute right of veto, but nevertheless, the US constructed very quickly a series of, if you will, collaborationist organs that expressed the elite, if you will, hegemony of this new class in political and juridical terms. Based on property, this is the Supreme Court run by an American, but essentially with auxiliaries of the Filipinos. The US, again, did not have people to populate or to people these various institutions, so it came to rely in all walks of life very extensively on co-opted subaltern Filipinos. This is Aguinaldo, 10 years after the insurrection, when he wins the prize for having the best American-grown corn, maize, in the Philippines. Just an instruction. The first thing the United States does, though, is a census. This is why I call this biopower. A census, very, very extensively mobilizing, again, Filipinos to do the actual work of the census. 7.5 million people, 25 plus ethnic minorities, and all these 7,000 islands presumably covered. What was the point of that exercise? Well, it was to do, again, a systemic survey, an inventory of the kinds of people that we actually possess in these islands, so that we can actually render more objective the kinds of policies that we want to impose upon them. These are the, and this is richly, if you really want to see what the US did in the Philippines by way of biopower, you should take a look at the several volumes of the census, because they have a lot of photographs attached to them. They photograph these presumed phrenological types. These are the Negritos. No, sorry, these are the Irigots. Typical Irigots, 1903. Coupled with these kind of before and after images, an Igorot boy, and then how he, with proper civilizational kind of impositions by the US, actually turns out to the right. Various transitions into a scout. Of all the groups, however, the census identified, the Negritos were the ones that actually, because of their size and because of presumably their low order, would never actually survive. The equivalent, the analog in a sense of the American Indian, where civilization would sort of, essentially extinguish them. The fundamental vehicle being education, educational procedures, and the US put a lot of emphasis on this in a racist sort of manner very often, of course. Imagine back home in these kinds of terms that they don't want to do it. The primary object and policy being vocational schooling, sewing, nursing, and metal shops for men, because that presumably tied in with the actual Filipino capabilities. The model being the Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee School for vocational training of American blacks back home. Very big emphasis on sports. Again, this is biopower, disciplining, but also kind of creating, presumably, strong Filipinos out of a hitherto weak kind of bodily culture. Calisthenics, basketball, baseball. This it looks ridiculous perhaps up to a certain, but this is not ridiculous. These sort of kind of practices, policies, schoolings, disciplining of the Filipinos in a very, even if it isn't extensive or as extensive as it seems, it is a project of how the US understands what it is to do benevolent empire in 1903. A lot of the images back home being about before and after, how the US kind of builds new schools, solid schools, how the US builds solid prisons. You can't get more kind of, if you will, panopticon like than this, as opposed to the old Spanish kind of prisons. Nevertheless, clean, hygienic new spaces, hygiene, sanitation being essentially essential objects. These are the kind of images that you typically get in American newspapers and magazines and reports back home. Here is kind of what it looks like. Here is what it looks like. This is what we have to do: sanitize, clean up, burn down, inoculate, and above all, build and see to it that we can contain epidemics and contagious diseases. The man, after Taft, became Secretary of War and then went on to become President of the United States, and left the Philippines behind. Who ran the show was this man, Cameron Forbes, a Boston Brahmin, grandson of Ralph Waldo Emerson, no less. A fanatical polo player, the founder of the Polo Club of Manila, which became the center of focus for ruling class and American interaction in Manila. Went on to become ambassador in Tokyo, where he also founded, interestingly, a polo club. He was not only a polo club player or fanatic, however, he was also a fanatical builder, and in particular builder of roads. And what the United States does in the Philippines, you could almost say above all, is to build roads. Why do they build roads? A, because of military objectives at the outset. B, because there is a very conscious, explicit policy that one of the big problems of the Philippine Islands is the absence of communication. If you don't have communication, you don't have trade, you don't have social interaction, you don't have society. In order to create a society in the Philippines, we need to have roads. And so this is what he does, above all, build roads. And the man he calls upon to kind of plan all this is our friend Daniel Burnham. 1905, on the instructions of Forbes, he goes to the Philippines, spends about a month and a half in the Philippines, and constructs a plan for Manila and for a summer capital called Baguio. And this is both are like Manila waterfront kind of central axis of that plan. At the same time, he's doing this city, which may give you an idea of, again, the Beaux-Arts kind of structure. This is Washington, D.C., the Mall of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., if you've been there, you know what the mall is about. It's a Beaux-Arts kind of central axis from Capitol Hill to the Lincoln Memorial, with lots of neoclassical structures on the side. And then there is another axis between Jefferson and the White House going across that mall. That was laid out by Burnham in the early 1900s to fulfill, in a sense, the original, before the fact, Beaux-Arts structure of L'Enfant in the 18th century. This is what it looks like. Typical, you see the cross. And this is what it looks like in the Manila version of it. He got a guy, a young Yale Beaux-Arts graduate, William Parsons, to execute it. And what he brought, above all, aside from a great architectural genius, in point of fact, to the Philippines at this stage, is this substance. It's not drugs. It's cement. It's the American version of cement, Portland cement in particular. The Americans recast public buildings in general, throughout the Philippines by importing and using this kind of very useful cement. It withstood the structures of the tropics, the earthquakes and so forth and so on, better than anything else. It was the single most important kind of, if you will, US importation into the Philippines, transformed the way the Philippines was being built, in the official domain at least. A lot of the architecture, the official architecture that the US put up, with Filipino auxiliaries, I might add, the Philippine architects that actually the US trained very quickly to do this, preserve some of the bizarre neoclassical idioms. You see, in fact, this is a university hall, this is a provincial government that Parsons put up. This could be directly taken from the 1893 Chicago Exposition. However, there is also something else going on. Parsons and Burnham were not simpletons. And again, Burnham is a modernist with a good sense up to a point for local circumstances. Parsons developed that and brought actually a kind of weird hybrid of US, Southern California, Spanish style, plus local Spanish architecture of the Philippines, plus American kind of, if you will, cement to the Filipino public architecture. This is the Manila Hotel. This is the Manila Hospital, or the prison. Is it the prison? Yeah, it's the General Hospital. You can see that this is a kind of idiom that you could find in Southern California as well. And this is not bad architecture. Is it imperial architecture? Good question. Good question. And this is the Bureau of Science, also by Parsons, also in the same kind of style. But about everything else, this is about roads. The before and after, and the construction, before and after, always before and after. And the construction of the huge road, the extremely difficult road to Baguio, which took an enormous amount of resources, but eventually was successful to this day. And if you go to Baguio in 2015, you find a Burnham Park, and you find this rather obnoxious looking kind of bust of Daniel Burnham. You will also find this man-made, quote unquote, avenue. It used to be the Dewey, originally it was the Cavite Boulevard. It then became the Dewey Boulevard after George Dewey, the victor of the naval battle. And then finally it became the Roxas Avenue Boulevard, and it still is. A reclaimed man-made boulevard along Manila Bay. And on that note, I will stop. So the upshot of all this is that there is no single upshot. That's why I said at the beginning of the talk that the sum total of this talk is less than the constituent parts. There are any number of tangents that you can pick up on and dispute. But if there is a point, if there is a kind of kernel to the whole spiel, it is about how does one actually understand what it is that constitutes the object of policy. How does one understand what it is to impose something or to treat something in this way rather than that way in 1900 from an American standpoint? And what's interesting to me on this score in Burnham's and the whole kind of progressive emerging discourse, coin a phrase, is that it is anti-exceptionalist, that it is consciously, very consciously and extensively a hooking up of the United States to what is perceived to be the best of European civilization. And that becomes then the best of imperial and imperialist civilization. And there is a way in which you can connect the US imperial and imperialist sensibility as it evolves in these various exemplary exhibits to the European counterpoint without becoming European pure and simple, with a kind of American twist to it. And that American twist is very much science, and it's very much rationality in the liberal sense, right? That is to say, liberal meaning the antitheses of the old European, not present European 1900, but old European kind of domination, slavery, anti-democratic version of civilization. On the contrary, a liberal sense of benevolent assimilation, to use McKinley's infamous or famous description of what the United States was doing in the Philippines. Meaning that you can understand inequality as duty and obligation to uplift those who are civilizationally retrograde. Because it is difficult in a liberal framework at first to think inequality in a systemic way as something that is not only there but needs to be, which needs to be addressed but does not actually ever end up with a kind of overcoming. And there is a deeply, of course, racially inflected kind of proto-scientific framing of these issues in 1900, even from a liberal standpoint, such that you can always assume in a liberal scientific framework in 1900 that those who are brown, Filipinos, Malay, or whatever other kind of skin color they happen to have in these various kind of minorities that we're encountering and counting in the Philippine Islands, will never actually truly, if you will, be assimilated, reach our level. But it's our obligation to see to it that we at least get them as far as they possibly can within the context of their objective limitations. And that's the way you can think liberally about the Philippines in 1900.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anders, for that wonderfully wide-ranging and thought-provoking talk. I'm aware that we have got about 15 minutes on the clock, so I will endeavour to keep my my comments as brief and ideally coherent as possible. I guess what I found really interesting was the narrative that you construct, where you start in the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s, where you're talking about these fairs, these expositions, both in Europe and then later in the United States, where you start with these attempts to define and understand the world, but also their own country, so also the United States and America's position within that world. Mm-hmm. And you track that through to the late 1900s and the what I suppose is the beginning of traditionally seen as the beginning of the imperialist venture for the United States as in its foreign policy terms. And I think what struck me here was I was always thinking about the work of Andrew Rotter, and particularly his article on the Empire of the Senses, which was in Diplomatic History from I forget what year, not that it matters. And this idea that you can understand US foreign relations by examining the five senses, and we see this in your presentation, where we see largely through images, largely through the kinds of images that show us that show us these kind of dirty streets in the Philippines, and this kind of sense that you get of the unhygienic versus the cleanliness, the white cities that we heard about earlier on. And I think that struck me, and in particular, your use of the architecture, which I'll admit, some of that went over my head. Not an architectural historian, but some of the ideas that you were talking about there, particularly with regards to the embrace by the United States or by these American expositions of neoclassicism, and how that is both conservative and harking back to the ideals of, say, the Roman Empire, and how that then kind of transposes when it comes to actual foreign policy. And this idea that these expositions, and I was certainly struck by some of the images where you see the pictures, you see the photos of these expositions in Chicago and elsewhere, and how well ordered they are. And you know, they've literally been drawn on a blue. That it is so ordered, and it strikes me that using architecture as a way into examining U.S. foreign relations and America's place in the world. Is an interesting sort of angle to talk about control, power and control, because if architecture is used to control your place in a city, in a country, and I think for the United States, and you see it in the images that you contrast with America and the Philippines, the before and the aftershots, this idea of utilizing architecture as a way of controlling or imposing order in some form on external forces. So I thought that was really interesting. I will just allow myself one question, I think, because I'll throw it open to the audience, because we only have about 15 minutes or so. And the thing that I was also really intrigued by, and there were many things actually, so if nobody wants to ask a question, I can have guess 3 or 4 or 5. Actually, the 2 things that I was struck by is, one, your final point where you talked about, you touched upon this idea of this kind of faith almost in science, in progress, and that kind of reminds me actually a lot of your work in your book Manifest Destiny. With one of its major contributions was the role of religion in U.S. foreign policy, and so I thought perhaps you could talk a little bit about that and where religion fits into this, particularly when thinking about the Philippines, which obviously is a former Spanish colony and has a large Catholic population and continues to do so today. So where religion fits into it, but also perhaps more broadly where this question of faith fits into it, because I think that makes it more interesting, particularly when thinking about faith in Manifest Destiny, faith in science and progress, and the ability to impose order. And then the kind of corollary of that question really is with regards to this question of the real and the real Philippines that we saw towards the end of your presentation. I was wondering where exactly the Filipinos themselves kind of fit into this, because we saw obviously a lot of the some of the elites that were perhaps co-opted by the United States with regards to the education of training of architects, and clearly in police force and military and so on and so forth. But I was kind of reminded of, I think it's Nick Culliper's book about U.S. Philippines relations, on this idea of the illusion of influence.
Right.
And I was just wondering where your narrative sort of fits into that, where this idea that, for those of you who don't know, Nick Culliper's argument is that rather than the U.S. Being U.S. Philippines relations being purely kind of colonial, imperial kind of instance as traditionally understood, what it actually is you see the Philippines engaging with and negotiating their own form of autonomy to some extent. So I was just intrigued, both, as I say, where the question of faith and religion comes in, and then where this question of the agency and the role of the Filipinos themselves, both at the elite level and then at the kind of grassroots level. I realised that that was not nearly as coherent or as brief as I promised, but I hope that there might be something there to which you can.
Oh yeah, I could use up the next 10 minutes to answer that. But in 1893, I mean, this is a sort of, for lack of a better word, genealogy. It's not as though here is the beginning, 1851, and then something marches through history, time and space. This something being something that you can describe, analyze, and essentialize. That's not the object of the exercise. The object of the exercise, very primitive version of it, is to say, 1851, we have something that is invented called World Expositions, and they do this and this and that. Then we have a variety of other kind of appropriations of this, and it opens up, given the kind of context in which they find themselves, to other kinds of ways of, including and excluding certain things. And so the Paris show 1889 begins the colonial exercise in a French context, where the showing of something in a mass cultural way. Remember, Walt Disney's dad worked on the Ferris wheel in 1893. This is the sort of thing that actually becomes, by one kind of track here is into Disney World. There's still the Disney World in Paris actually uses a kind of version of the Buffalo Bill show of 1889, which so very much impressed Rizal, the great nationalist or proto-nationalist poet and figure who was shot, killed, assassinated, I was about to say, by the Spanish in 1896. The wilder patches, those are the people we should be like, said Rizal in 1889. In any case, the genealogy here is a condition, set of conditions of possibilities in 1851. Here is 1889. Here is 1893. In 1893, what Burnham, McKim, the Hunt, father and son, all these architects who have been to Paris, gone through the rigorous pedagogy, extraordinarily wide, elitist education that the Beaux-Arts school provided architecture. Remember, in the 1800s, there is no professional architecture in the United States. MIT began it on Beaux-Arts grounds in 1867 or something like that, and Columbia followed under McKim's leadership in the 1890s. But, an architect is essentially a well-trained carpenter. And there is no open education or competition for public architecture until after 1893, when there is a law in the US that actually creates it. And you get all these. And then Beaux-Arts architecture and all the things that went with it, the aesthetic that went with it, became, to coin a phrase, hegemonic. But that's a different story. I'm not an architectural historian either. But in any case, in 1893, the enemy is the immigrant city. The object of the exercise is not to create an imperial language or a liberal imperialist discourse. The object of the exercise is how do we impose order, legibility, intelligibility, clarity, sanity on the American city. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the context of Chicago. Well, New York perhaps as well. An immigrant city with immigrants in political or politically powerful positions, but also unhygienic, dirty, anarchic, difficult to read, bad architecture, jumbled up architecture, rapaciously capitalist, and all these sorts of things. Right? I mean, you can see how powerfully this kind of, let's build a modern city called the White City. Boom. Right? And let's do it in a neoclassical, absolutely unequivocally rational manner. You could see how this deeply reactionary kind of architectural idiom becomes, if you will, progressive. And then, boom, fast forward. Nobody's expecting 1898. Nobody's expecting the effects of 1898. The effects of 1898 is a colonial empire. And so suddenly, you know, we have a new object of knowledge called empire colonial possessions. We need to figure out, where does the United States fit into that? How do we represent this? How do we make this enormously weird, exotic, distant place called the Philippines an object of policy, where we can say we're doing something that is genuinely American and progressive in this space, which is never going to be American. Nobody in 1900 ever, from left to right to yonder, believes that the Philippines will ever be American. There is never going to be an American space called the Philippines. It's always going to be different. You can imagine Cuba, perhaps, but not the Philippines. And so that's the way in which this kind of notion becomes, this kind of problem becomes inserted into what has gone on before. So it's not a single thing going through, called the Imperial sensibility. It's a series of conditions of possibility that, you know, at various stages suddenly open up for something that then becomes unexpectedly something else. Now, that's a convoluted argument, but nevertheless, that's the logic of the exercise. Religion, yeah, they hated the Philippines as a Spanish. I mean, nothing is more retrograde from an American Protestant standpoint than Spanish Catholicism. Exemplified with all graphic obviousness in Latin America. This is the, you know, knee-jerk US dominant Protestant reaction to this. Catholicism, and they often forget that the Philippines are actually largely Catholic. They say, well, we will Christianize them. Well, you know, there is a certain tradition in the Philippines, actually the one successful Catholic kind of operation in Asia, which is called Catholicism. You know, we saw the recent visit by the Pope. And so the US sort of forgets that, but they can always bracket that. They can say, well, the Spanish period brought a lot of bad stuff with it, but at least we can build on it. We can, you know, get rid of the medieval. In fact, the word medieval is typical. The medieval Spanish legacy. Retrograde, anti-educational, reactionary, feudal, monarchical, fill in the blanks. Actually, the Philippines, as a kind of Spanish colonial possession, was unique in the Spanish context because it relied on the friars, it relied on religious orders to do the actual mediating between the Spanish 15,000 people who actually controls the Philippine Islands and the actual population, which brings me to the other issue, Nick's argument. Yes, most of what I said here is entirely superficial, in meaning not the subjugation, not the actual pacification, which was never total, never enclosed or actually applied to the Moros, the Islamic Moros in Mindanao, properly, but nevertheless was reasonably successful given the preconditions, right? And would never work unless they'd co-opted, developed indigenous repressive forces, which became a model for how the United States would do this in Latin America and elsewhere. Less successfully, actually. And it would never have worked had it not been the case that the Filipino islands, the archipelago, was so diversified, not only physically diversified and a difficult terrain in that sense, but also ethnically, linguistically, and so forth and so on, extraordinarily, in that sense, an abstraction. So on that score, what the US did as a project is interesting because what it says about the US, but what the US does ultimately is of very limited significance. It's a great significance in terms of what happens to the Philippines as the Philippines down the line, but it is in the context of 1900 of very limited effect in terms of, you know, the central institutions and so forth and so on, but not unimportant. Not unimportant. I guess what Nick is driving at on that score is the notion that the United States is here and the Philippines are here, and the US brings something to the Philippines, and the Philippines actually react to that, and we have a fight, and then we negotiate. But that's not exactly what happens. There are coalitions, as in all these various contexts of imperial rule. There are coalitions of indigenous forces against other indigenous forces, and there are coalitions of various kinds of American interests. In the US case, economic interests, because a lot of this goes by the wayside when they realize that, well, there wasn't very much economic, you know, wherewithal to be had by controlling the Philippines. In fact, strategically, it's an Achilles heel. It didn't bring the China market into the American orbit. It didn't really make the US very much by way of economic exploitation at all. So there wasn't really ultimately very much of an American interest in the Philippines, objectively, which is why they can do these kinds of projects. Imagine these kinds of projects, and the Philippines can become this site where you can kind of inscribe, according to various kinds of really fantasy-orientated projects, all manner of concepts. And that's why the World Expositions, as a laboratory for these kinds of ways of thinking about a policy object called the Philippines, is to me very exciting and interesting, which is...
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting way to sort of end that. I mean, this idea that the Philippines itself is Chicago, it's these expositions.
And it can be no other. Mm. Anyway, I think
we're up to about 6:30, so I think it would be nice if we throw just for a couple of questions if people are open to a few questions and hang on for a little bit.
I'll be very brief in responding to them.
I just wonder if you think that anything has changed. You're talking about what happened 100 years ago, but if you look at some of the interventions in the Philippines now, with for instance, the Balikatan exercises, the joint military exercises, they are building roads. You talked about the water cure. It's as though the Philippines 100 years ago was a testing ground for things that the Americans are doing now, both still in the Philippines and elsewhere. I don't know if you'd thought of it in those terms, but to me, nothing much has changed in terms. In Manifest Destiny, you could say that this is the kind of rationale behind the liberalism, even of the war on terror. Nothing much has changed.
The war on terrorism, terror is obviously there are analogies, and the chief analogy has to do with pacification, because this is not a war. This is not a war. It's not understood as a war. It's understood as a policing operation. And the distinction between a war and a policing operation is very, very important on that score. It is actually not fighting an equal. It's fighting somebody who's essentially a transgressor. So that's true. And in fighting criminality, transgression of this kind, you're entitled to use whatever sort of means that you have at your disposal, including torture. So there is a liberal version of Guantanamo in that kind of thinking, which I very much recognized as analogical with what happened in the Philippines. Yes, however, let me just say this, which goes back to my answer to the last color-informed question. What the United States does now, or what the United States has been doing all over East Asia and elsewhere, is a military strategic operation, i.e. inscribing various places with military strategic importance and acting accordingly. But in 1900, that's not the way they operate. You know, the size of the US military in 1900 is a dime and a dozen, I was about to say. It's about, you know, all of the US military was actually in the Philippines in 1900. Well, 70,000 soldiers at the very peak of the engagement. They didn't have much more than that. They had a big navy, but essentially the US as a military power is not terribly impressive, navies aside, in 1900. So there isn't this kind of global inscription of US strategic military spaces that you find in 2015. In fact, that you find after 1945, where the entire globe is essentially a military map. The world is not a military map in 1900. It's a commercial space, it's a commercial map. There are lots of American interests here and there and yonder, but there isn't really this kind of notion that we need to create a militarized space in the Philippines. The object of the exercise in 1900 is to kill Aguinaldo. They capture him and they turn him. And he lives forever after. I was about to say, you know, the American ambassador in the 1960s gave him back his fort in the 1960s. So he was co-opted. But the object of the exercise is not really to kind of set up anything, well, a naval base, yes, but not really to kind of, there is no real organic interest in doing the Philippines. After the 1980s, when they gave up on the base and so forth, there is a way in which you have to reinscribe the Philippines in an American orbit of military interest. And to that extent, you have to do what you always have to do when you're in the American military. Create roads, infrastructure, see to it that you control the space. Even though I think technology is changing the logic of how you do that. So I wouldn't say it's the same thing exactly as 100 years ago, even though some of the means are disturbingly similar.
Okay, I'm aware we probably all want to get back to Hollyoaks, so we have time for one short question and one short answer.
Very short. That's a very good question.
Short one. Well, I'm working on the concentration camps in Cuba, and you know that in the Philippines in the 1901,
right.
They took more or less the same strategy in Batangas, they are ranking the use of camps against the Filipinos that was to hand those victims. So all that process, what do you fit in that process with this with your analysis of this liberal version of the American imperialism? Because it was an investigation by the CNA of what the project is. To me, it looks like a conflict between the old way of doing this counterinsurgency and a new way to use concentration camps, another way of managing the population.
Well, so would you argue, I didn't get the exact point about the camps in the novel circumstances of the Philippines.
Well, the Pacification of Luzon, there were two main campaigns.
Right.
Northern Luzon was a more traditional way.
Right.
With the colonists and that. And in southern Luzon, in Batangas, we used this scorched policy, use of the concentration camps for the civilians, and this way of forming new villages for the rural population. I was just wondering how this, if you've come across any debate in the early 20th century on this process created some conflicts in this vision of the Philippines.
No, the only debate I've ever really come across on that score in contemporary terms is the debate whether we're just rehearsing or doing exactly what we kind of went after Wheeler for in Cuba, right, with the extraordinary propaganda there. Well, actually, it wasn't propaganda, it was correct in many ways. The critique of the Spanish rule in Cuba because of precisely the concentrados as a policy which killed by means of starvation thousands and thousands of Cubans. We're doing the same thing. No, we're not doing the same thing. And we're not doing the same thing, says then the other side of this coin. We're just basically, preserving rather than killing off. We're protecting rather than exposing. We're doing what concentration camps should be doing, which is to say protection in exchange for obedience. That's the only debate I've ever seen, aside from the people who say that the US is basically like Mark Twain, we're just being hypocritical. But it's never, even though I grant you exactly what you said about, you're right about Luzon and what happens, but it's never on the scale of what Whaler does in Cuba. And it doesn't have the same organic effects, if I may put it that way. Right. I mean, Whaler does this in an extraordinarily extensive and intensive and effective way, in a way that the Americans never really achieve or want to achieve in the case of in the Philippines. But do you have a comeback on that? Okay.
I think that could be a conversation that continues.
Yeah, that's it.
I think all that's left to do is thank you all very much for coming and
Yeah,
to
thank you.
thank Professor Stephanson for the